preparedness. We would like to talk with you, to share with you what have we learned from the Nepal earthquake response. What worked, what didn't work, what are we doing right, what do we need to do differently. More importantly, in a minute I will be introducing the speakers, and I will be asking the speakers to give as many as possible practical examples, from hands-on experience in the application of the preparedness response in Nepal, hoping that this will inspire, will guide all of you to take these practical suggestions, these lessons learned in your own context, in your own operation, from wherever you are listening to this conversation today. I'm actually encouraged to see that we have over 100 people who are registered for this afternoon's webinar, many colleagues from Africa, Middle East, North America. I also see some from Asia. It must be in the middle of the night for you. Today's topic on preparedness is we're going to be talking about the preparedness measures that are in place to ensure an effective response on the ground. As you must probably know, the preparedness is actually in the central heart of the transformative agenda of the humanitarian reform, where we have two protocols, the common framework for preparedness and also the emergency response for preparedness. The common framework for preparedness basically looks at how to reduce the impact of emergencies on the communities, how to build resilience to be able to withstand the impact of an emergency as part of a disaster risk management. The second protocol, the emergency response and preparedness, looks primarily from an interagency standing committee at the preparedness in terms of early warning indicators, contingency planning, and other actions to improve a coordinated approach. I think we all agree how important preparedness is, how vital it is to be able to respond quickly, how cost-effective it is if we prepare well in advance, but more importantly, how it can save lives during these crucial moments when a crisis hits, in order to make sure that everything is set up in place to be able to best respond. But talk more on the preparedness and the actions that have been taking place from the Nepal experience. I have with me 4 distinguished guests that are here to share with all of you their lessons learned and best experience from the Nepal. I'd like to introduce Tony Gregg, who is the co-chair of the Interagency Standing Committee Task Force on Preparedness and Resilience. He's also the Senior Emergency Preparedness and Response Advisor for the World Food Program, and Tony is with me here in Geneva. Welcome, Tony. I'd like to introduce Victoria Stodart, who is the Senior Officer for the Shelter and Settlement Cluster, working with the International Federation for the Red Cross. And as you know, IFRC is the agency lead with regards to shelter. I'd like to introduce Jamie McGoldrick. Jamie is currently the resident coordinator, humanitarian coordinator in Yemen, but up until December last year, he was the humanitarian coordinator in Nepal, and he will be speaking for his experience on Nepal. And lastly, we have Dylan Winder, who is the head of the humanitarian policy. He's joining this conversation from London, where he's working for DFID. So a warm welcome to all 4 panelists, and very much looking forward to hearing your reactions. I'm going to start actually the first question with you, Tony. And I'd like to ask you, as the co-chair of the task team on preparedness and resilience, can you tell us a little bit about the task force and a little bit about the importance of it and how it's applied at the operations? And before you actually go into your answer, I want to say 2 words on the webinar itself that I should have said up front. So as you see on your screen, there is a central part where there's going to be a PowerPoint that we're going to go through, which we'll email to all of you. On the top right-hand side of the screen, there is 3 buttons. There is a chat box in the middle that I'd like to encourage you all to use the chat box and send message to all participants. You will also see a Q&A box, which, again, from the very beginning, I'd like to encourage you to send questions to the speakers. I will be taking the questions and addressing these questions during the second 45 minutes of the webinar. During the first 45 minutes, I will be asking each speaker with 1 or 2 questions to present the topic, and then 45 minutes past the hour, we'll be taking your questions, which please feel free to be as blunt, as direct, and of course, contextualized to your own situation, so we can hopefully provide some practical operational feedback that can help you with the issues that you're facing and wherever you're listening from. There is an opening poll that has just been opened with some basic questions. We're basically trying to understand who is listening. I also want to make sure, share with you the fact that this webinar is recorded and will be available online. If you have any colleagues who would like to refer to, they can replay the webinar. And also, if any of you are having trouble with the sound, I want to point out that there is a YouTube direct line. You see the link on your screen where you can access and hopefully have a better sound if you're not able to access it through this through the internet. So Tony, back to you with a question about a little bit the task force and its role and the results of your work.
Okay, Panos, thank you very much. The current task team, which is becoming a reference group on early warning and preparedness, has a number of lines of work, and you can see them on the screen, those of you who can see a screen. Operationally, it produces early warning reports, and the main customer there is the Emergency Directors Group, but also donors and others. You'll notice on this slide that there are things in brackets. For instance, against the early warning reports, it's got anticipate, do not wait. The items in brackets are taken from the Secretary General's report to the World Humanitarian Summit, and it's just an indication that we have been firing on all cylinders in that type of activity. It's relevant to the way humanitarian action is going. From the perspective of norms and technical support, the current task team has kind of 2 breakouts, and Panos has mentioned those, the emergency response preparedness approach and the common framework. They're broken into really our readiness, so the IASC's readiness and the IASC's ability to support readiness of others. So there are these 2 very broad approaches, and we also link the 2. And for those of you who've read the Secretary General's report, there's a notion of as local as possible, as international as necessary. The work we've been doing certainly reflects that, and it will into the future. As well as the emergency response preparedness approach that you will hear about a little bit specifically in relation to Nepal, we examine methodologies for such things as simulations. Importantly, we've been looking at how we make the case, not so much for preparedness, because I think that has been widely made that we should prepare, but what is the best sort of preparedness? Where do you get the best return? And we'll hear about that later from Dylan as well. In terms of what went on in Nepal, I've grouped comment into these 4 takeaways, for want of a better word. The basics matter. Well, there are no silver bullets, and I think one of the big things we've found from Nepal and others is that we have to look after the basics. And for this, in the approach under the ERP, minimum response preparedness measures, minimum preparedness actions are those basics in a large part. I should say right through these comments that a health warning is that one size does not fit all, and what may be relevant to natural disasters in a country like Nepal may not be relevant to preparedness for armed conflict or humanitarian action in armed conflict. So please bear that in mind. An important aspect that we've seen in Nepal was be a smart or savvy investor. Preparedness should be treated as an investment, not a cost, not something that's buried as a nice to do if you've got some money in what are typically underfunded projects. It should be viewed as an investment. In that sense, we need to get a better handle on what are the best things that we can invest in, and you would have remembered that I just spoke about that in terms of what the task team has been doing and the reference group will do. This is not, though, about stealing money from response. This is discrete investment in preparedness that is in addition to money that would be used in response. This said, there must be a degree of no regrets. Even though you're a savvy investor, sometimes things won't happen. That's a good thing, but prudent to prepare for them. There will be limited funding. We recognise that, so we need to prioritise high-risk situations. Nepal, obviously, very high-risk situations, as we saw. There are others around the world, so globally we need to prioritise situations as well. We also need to give greater accountability to this investment process. The ERP helps that because it helps make the case for the investment. Also, we need to have better reaction and accountability to the early warning that's issued, not so much for an earthquake, of course, but at the global level, we have an early warning process, and we need better accountability for reacting to that on behalf of all actors, ourselves, the donors, and others. We also need better professionalisation, and this was one thing that was picked up or mentioned by some in Nepal. Another issue is that we need to be coherent. Nepal had this lesson, or not so much a lesson, but observation in a number of areas. We need to be coherent across time, so not looking at artificial phases such as prevention, preparedness, immediate response and recovery. We need to be looking at them as a whole, and we need the ability to work in parallel during those processes. We also need to be looking at national lead, so coherence between international and national actors. And indeed, this is a big theme of parts of the World Humanitarian Summit, both in its consultations and in the Secretary-General's report. This might mean that we don't use clusters, we use the national way of responding. Obviously, that is certainly not a one-size-fits-all, and we have to do that on a case-by-case basis. I was asked this morning whether the clusters have a role in helping national capacity. Of course they do, is the answer, because they have expertise in lines of activity. They're going to be relevant no matter what type of organisation is used in managing a response or preparedness, for that matter. We also need coherence across lines of activity, and what I'm talking about there is the clusters, and in modalities, cash versus in-kind. Be familiarity. Time and reconnaissance is seldom wasted, as they say, and in high-risk situations, we need people who are going to surge in who are familiar, and indeed you need that with all sorts of humanitarian response, familiar with the situation on the ground. Surge should not push aside those who are there. Surge needs to complement that. I've highlighted surge, but another thing about familiarity is leadership. And I'm not saying this is because Jamie's in the room, but it really does pay to have leadership of the response that understands the local context, but importantly for humanitarian responders, understands how we operate. And we would have been, I think, seen a completely different outcome in Nepal if the leadership was not well versed in how the humanitarian system works and issues with it. To finalise, being familiar, we did pick up the power of simulations. people working together before this happened. There were many people who surged in from the region who had been to Nepal numerous times doing large-scale simulation exercises, doing ERP indeed, and doing planning. So with that, Panos, I think I'll hand back.
Thank you. Thanks, Tony. I want to highlight that actually the protocols, the Common Framework for Preparedness and the Emergency Response Preparedness protocols, are both at the IASC, Interagency Standing Committee website for any colleagues who may want to access them. Now, I'd like us to move to our second panelist, Victoria, and Victoria Stodart with the International Federation of Red Cross. Victoria, can you tell us, you were deployed to Nepal as part of the surge capacity. So can you tell us what is it that worked? What really tested us as a community, and what are our challenges in terms of the response that we've had in Nepal? So that would be very helpful for colleagues listening around the world, and hopefully we can take these lessons over to other operations. Victoria.
Thank you, Panos. And just good afternoon to everyone. Just to clarify, I was there for the first month as Global Surge. And just this first slide is just a very quick overview, just to give you some stats. I'm not going to run through them because you can read. But really, shelter, we mean, is tarpaulins, tents, roofing sheets, lumber and tools. And non-food items is really kitchen sets, clothing, blankets, buckets, etc. I will go forward to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so preparedness for the shelter cluster. We were active since 2008 for the Koshi floods, and we remained as a cluster regularly meeting with each other, probably once every 1 or 2 months. With up to 10 to 20 agencies meeting, responding to small and medium-scale disasters that didn't require international assistance. We had an agreed contingency plan in place between the government and the agencies themselves. They had undertaken scenario planning, although with the scenario planning was really looking at floods and also an earthquake in Kathmandu itself, which, as we know, also affected the rural areas. So I think the feedback from Nepal is that our scenario planning wasn't totally on the ball. But I think coming out of that, it sort of sounds like we had it sorted. Nepal, the earthquake was massive. We had at least 120 operational agencies coming on board. So it's nice to have a contingency plan agreed. It's difficult to get another 110 agencies to agree to it when they're responding straight away. So what worked for us, I think the fact that we had been a cluster and we'd been active, there was an awareness of our business, of the cluster approach. Partners and government knew each other, they trusted each other. And I think, as Tony was saying, there was that real extent of familiarity amongst everyone. We had a very well-established national coordinator, Sanjeev, who remained on for the rest of the response as a deputy coordinator. He was key to all the coordinators that came through. I mean, he not only could speak the language, which helped immensely, but he could really guide us through the trickiness of government as it continued to change and the different political processes. He also had a very well-established relationship with national NGOs as well as international NGOs that had offices there. I think the agreed approach with the contingency plan was great. It meant that we could scale up very, very quickly. We had contact details. Obviously, Sanjeev helped massively with that. We had agreed specifications. We had agreed kits and assessment questions. So it meant that we could do our strategy pretty quickly, and that, I think, gave the donors a bit of hope that we knew what we were talking about. But what tested us a huge amount, it has to be said. Picking out just sort of the 3 key issues, just sort of on reflection. The private sector, we just really hadn't engaged with the private sector previously, just even down to the basic stuff of mapping the suppliers and the producers of the main shelter items. having that discussion with them about quality of the shelter goods, I think just that would have had an immense impact. It's not the time nor the place to start having that discussion when we're into the response. And certainly Jamie's office were very kind in getting the Chamber of Commerce together for us to meet with them. But we really should have done this beforehand, and I think this is something the Global Shelter Cluster will really push our country-level clusters to work on now in the preparedness phase. We should look to have pre-agreements in place with the main suppliers. We know generally what a shelter response will look like. We know what we're going to have to use, so we really need to get wise to it. Also, just how to interact with the private sector. This isn't just a shelter cluster issue. I think it's a response issue overall. But when we talk about self-recovery, we need to know who isn't getting goods and who needs our support. And without engaging with the private sector and civil society and mapping what they're doing, we really are sort of failing in our ability to engage at the local level. Cash for shelter, I think this is a well-known fact, was slightly behind the curve. Cash has really been in the domain of food security and livelihoods. We need to kind of get a bit more quick on our feet and be part of the market assessments that begin right at the start. But this is really about trying to sort of get the cash community to understand the shelter technicalities, really, about quality, about environmental impact, if we're pushing for build back better safety standards, what that might look like with additional lumber requirements. And also another issue for us is when we do conditional cash programs in shelter, we do a lot of technical training and provide a lot of technical guidance. And this becomes a real opportunity or a tricky opportunity to try and roll that out with unconditional cash or multi-purpose cash grants. How do we really truly ensure that people are building back safer when effectively cash is being given out without the guidance that we could provide? And I think this is something we really need to work with communication experts. I know certainly in Nepal, BBC Media Action were very helpful in trying to translate technical terms into verbal conversation. Local level coordination, again, as Tony was mentioning, this is a real challenge, I think, for clusters. Obviously, it's a huge financial burden for the lead agencies to put coordination teams in place, but we really need to be talking to partners that are active in those districts and have had those relationships with government, and looking at how we can support them better through donor support and also human resource support, capacity build them in the preparedness phase so that they understand what our needs are and what our processes are. This is, I mean, certainly in Nepal, it was so evident, 14 districts, very different government structures in place and different personalities. And if you can't engage at the district level, then it's very, very difficult to coordinate. We could also see this going up as well. Again, Jamie's office very kindly arranged a meeting with the World Bank for me day 3. I have to say it's a language that I'm new to. I need to get better at understanding the development world. But this is, it was great to see that, to see the start of the sort of humanitarian and development conversation. But it's something that we shouldn't be afraid of. And I think it's a lack of our own knowledge that sort of perhaps makes those conversations difficult to have. And again, DFID, not just because Dylan's on the line, but DFID were very, very supportive of the shelter cluster and very helpful with our advocacy in very many different ways, and also with our transition out. So ongoing challenges, well, it's not new and it's not exciting, it's just very necessary. We can have these conversations and we can write papers about preparedness and how important it is, but if we don't have the money to ensure that the people that we train remain in those positions, then it's going to be difficult to make sure that the money that's spent is delivered well. And also, I think just funding, predictable funding to the global clusters to help support that capacity building and the preparedness phase. And finally, and this is just really probably a bit off the wall, but I think we were lucky that it wasn't a Kathmandu earthquake. I mean, obviously Kathmandu was affected, but a huge amount of money has been invested in urban preparedness. But I really got the sense that I was relieved that it wasn't an urban response, because I don't know if we really are ready when we're considering private sector, civil society and municipal coordination as well.
Thanks, Victoria, for sharing your reflections, really coming from the field. Before moving to the next panelist in question, I want to remind everybody about the Q&A box. Please, I want to encourage you to send questions that I will be directing to the panelists that you have from your own context, coming from your daily challenges or issues. And as you hear to the panelists speak, don't hesitate to send us questions, which I will be taking in about 15-20 minutes and asking live, so we can all learn from your specific issues and challenges that you face on the ground. So the Q&A box is on the top right-hand side of the screen. You will see a Q&A, and once you press into there, you can send me a question that I'll be then taking on. I'd like now to move to our third panelist, Jamie McGoldrick. Jamie, you were in Nepal during the critical period where the earthquake took place and the response that followed. I think we all agree on the vital importance of leadership, making sure that the right decisions are made at the ground level, bringing together the entire humanitarian community, supporting the government, most importantly, supporting the people who have been affected to ensure the most effective response. So, Jamie, I would like to ask you, having worked now in the preparation for preparedness and then the response, what would you say that made the biggest difference in the Nepal response? What was it that worked and helped to ensure a timely and effective response?
Okay, thanks, Panos. Let me first of all start off by just giving some context. I mean, obviously, Nepal is a very vulnerable country for natural disasters. It was always seen to be earthquake-prone, two massive plates rubbing against each other, annual monsoons taking place, wiping out villages and that type of thing. We were planning throughout for an earthquake taking place in the Kathmandu Valley, and it didn't happen there. It happened further up the country in the Himalayas. You also have to say that there was some serious challenges politically in Nepal. A governance problem, no local elections for 17 years, post-conflict, no constitution working, a very fluid political landscape. You know, on flood management, which we did a lot of our work to prepare for the response, there were, 5 ministries involved in how we actually do flood response, and that gives you an idea of how complex it is to coordinate and work with that. At the same time, this rapidly urbanizing population put a lot of pressure on systems that were there, and the inability for municipal authorities to manage that growth. The thing is, Nepal should be the most prepared country in the world, given all the focus it's been on, the attention that's been given to it, and all the investment that's been made in it. But at the same time, we saw that during the floods, the annual floods of 2013 and 2014, how unable we were to respond properly, and how the architecture had become overblown and bloated, and leading to a lack of accountability and problems of responsibility for the key actors, including the government and ourselves. So we spent a year before the earthquake actually stripping back and stripping down our systems and how we operate, how we respond, how we prepare. And we did that in order to try and improve our response for the 2015 monsoon season. But, as you know, that then was taken over by the earthquake. But I think it's been clear that the reviews have shown that the contribution made by that approach to critically look at how we responded and prepare for response was a very helpful exercise to get us to where we are. And I think it helped the humanitarian country team to be much more effective and to actually deploy better and quicker around across the emergency of the earthquake. And I'll talk about the emergency response preparedness exercise in a minute, which is linked to that. A lot of investment was made over the years, and I think that helped to improve the response. How you measure that, hard to say. But it's also said that, the STAIT review that's just been out is saying that it's important that we prepare through developing, supporting human resources to actually oversee, guide and steward the preparedness, but also to protect the investments that are there. Maintaining this will be a challenge, the investments, to keep those going when money is short. The STAIT report also looks at 100 recommendations for the Resident Coordinator's Office, the Humanitarian Country Team, and then that's okay, but a lot of Resident Coordinator's Office don't have a capacity, and when you don't have capacity, how do you keep that going? This is one of the questions I'd put out there. At the time of the earthquake, when it did strike, we were in a 4 years into investment in terms of preparedness through the Nepal Risk Reduction Consortium, and we were part of a 20-year plan that had to be done. It was a whole generation that had to be invested in. And this is not comfortable for national governments, it's not comfortable for international community, but either humanitarian or development actors. But the economic case for preparedness and DRR is well established, but there's really serious reluctance by donors and others to the implication that this has on development practice. And I think it's important that we have to recognise humanitarian do not work in a 20-year window, and the responsibility must then be built into and embedded into core development practices in business and of government and support to governments. In Nepal, we try to marry the humanitarian actors with development institutions with mixed results. As was mentioned by Victoria, conversations across those domains don't happen easily. We had a series of reviews over the years. The most recent one was 2013, the Nepal Risk Reduction, and it looked at the collective efforts at awareness and trying to raise the idea of a seismic threat and how it would impact on the communities. And what we did was we actually managed to get a budget expanded for that, and I think that's an important advocacy and lobbying that took place there. But at the same time, I think donors and governments and agencies were, they were all challenged to actually make a jump from having individual projects to being more collective. And the Nepal Risk Reduction Consortium brought them round the table, provided a platform for that. And I think that was important. The challenge here is how to get local communities and local authorities to focus away from those regular landslides and, floods, but to look instead at something a bit more dramatic. And when you're looking at the projects supporting the floods, to get them to switch gear and look at something which may come at some point but you don't quite know is difficult. In the Kathmandu Valley, we were able to generate a public awareness. We got people with go bags, equipped with tools for search and rescue. Community-based initiatives were there through Red Cross and other community development organisations. But then at the district level where the earthquake took place, we didn't have that level of engagement. We didn't have that investment there. And I think that was shown to be something really difficult. It should also be said that, the cluster system in Nepal was handed over to the government. It was nationalised by government. I personally think it was done too prematurely. It never should have happened without the investment in getting those clusters, and especially the government, to be better versed in what their responsibilities were. So we had this shadow system where you had nominally the government in charge of the cluster, but operationally it was international community and national actors actually made it work. And it's something we should have taken stock of and agreed on very early on. All of that said, the clusters were activated within 5 hours of the earthquake, and at the same time the first health cluster meeting took place within, it got going straight away. The level of familiarity was not seen at district level, and I think it's important that we try to do that and spread our word outside the capital. And now we've been caught short this time because the preparedness for the Kathmandu Valley earthquake didn't happen, and I think we have to revisit that. And then how can we then get institutionalised preparedness at the local level when you don't have a local authority to deal with? It's left to the community actors, to the Red Cross movement and others. Pre-positioning took place in Kathmandu, in the valley in particular, in some of the affected districts, and the after-action review showed that to be a good investment, although I think some of the stocks were not properly used, some were out of date and never were replaced, and I think it points very much at the local level. How do you invest in maintaining those stocks to be appropriate, relevant, and used at the right time? And it's something, it costs money, and I'm not sure people would invest in it. I'll mention the humanitarian staging area. I think this was the only international airport in Kathmandu, and this was put up weeks before, and it's for the government. It was put in place by DFID and supported by the logistics cluster. It was the result of many years of lobbying and advocacy on the part of the international community to have that in place, and we were very lucky. And this was a win that I think here is a very key issue. But this win, how will you sustain it? How will you hand it over to government and keep it going? And how will you have that investment maintained when the value for money case still continues? And then, as I mentioned earlier, the emergency response preparedness process, Nepal was chosen of 1 or 2 countries to have this happen. We were lucky to have the regional office for OCHA come in from Bangkok and help through us with November 14 and again in March 2015 to set the scene for us to improve our response to the floods that were due in June of that year. And as you know, we then got the earthquake. But that investment, and as Tony's point about familiarity, it brought in people and had a comfort among us on how we would actively respond to a crisis. I think what we also did in that process, we identified 2 tiers of clusters. A tier 1 of clusters who were the immediate responders for a sudden onset disaster, and the tier 2 clusters are ones who would come in when an early recovery process kicked in. And that helped, I think, focus us on how to trigger the response, to how to get the appropriate data in place, disaggregated for the districts. And I think because of that, we were able to put a flash appeal out in 4 days, and the first sit rep out in 36 hours. And that was that familiarity, that understanding of the systems, and an acceptance of what we needed to do on the day. I think the state review has noted the beneficial effect of the ERP mechanism upon our readiness and praised the lightness of it. And I think that's something, how do you get that in other countries, get the balance right between being ready and not overdoing it? And just to sort of flag the point that Tony made about simulations, the simulation exercise routines that took place in that country with the OCHA, with the WFPs, with the Department of Defense, the US military, with the resident coordinators office, the flagship too, I think the military trainings and the simulations provided an insight into planning and response. And, you know, despite the fact that this was not an earthquake that we were planning for, we were looking for the Kathmandu Valley, I think the joint preparedness on an annual basis, I think, built systems and built familiarity with systems and what we could expect to manage and what we could expect of each other. OCHA pulled out in Nepal 2013, but that didn't really impact too much because I think the regional office was very helpful and very consciously worked to sustain relationships through working with the preparedness activities. I think having them there in place on March 2015 on the flood preparedness, and then those were the same guys, the same cast of characters who turned up when the emergency, when the earthquake took place. We had the same team in place who could work with the actors they knew, and the humanitarian country team was extraordinarily helpful. We also would put in place an expanded humanitarian country team, which included donors, and we had national actors and international actors. The donors we had in the room were the usual humanitarian funders. That was DFID, ECHO, and USAID. And we used those on a daily basis when the earthquake took place. They met with me in the office. We worked out what the challenges, we worked out what the focus should be, and we used it to push the clusters into a certain corralling them around, you know, for the flash appeal, but also for the response, and then more importantly for pushing the clusters and the whole coordination mechanism away from the capital up to the affected areas and build these logistic hubs, which then became the backbone of the response. I think having the value of donors on the ground and their intentions to remove the barriers and coordinate among themselves inside the daily meetings, and then that to be then shown and demonstrated very forcefully in the humanitarian country team meetings, I think helped put discipline and focus and help keep the clusters and keep the humanitarian country team very, very focused. I'll mention 2 other things. As Victoria mentioned, the private sector. We had established links with the private sector, water trucking, for example, to ensure that the rapid response to earthquakes was there. But I think we haven't done enough, as is mentioned. We have to do much, much more on that. We have to reach out to the private sector to find how we can work with them well before in advance and not see it as something, you know, an extractive relationship. It should be seen as not an opportunity for resourcing ourselves, but in fact should be seen as a delivery mechanism and a potential change agent. And we should actually maximise this resort collectively and not individually, as we do in the UN family, chasing money through the private sector. And we have to do that quite soon. And just the last part we have to do more of, and we did a little bit, was cash, the use of cash. Given the complexities and topography of the situation in Nepal, having cash more online and available, it would have been a much better, faster response, given the difficulties of logistics. There were some complications over the banking sector, some complications over the government understanding the purpose of it, and that's what we have to do in advance to prepare the government. I'll stop there. Over to you.
Jamie, thanks a lot. What a richness in terms of feedback and your own experience from Nepal in terms of what works. You covered a wide variety of angles or aspects of the response, and coming from having really tested it and tried it, that's of tremendous value, I'm sure, to everybody who is listening. I'm actually going to move us now to London, and I'd like to take a question to Dylan Winder, who's the head for the Humanitarian Policy and Partnership at DFID. Dylan, welcome to this webinar. I'd like to ask you, DFID has supported the World Food Programme and UNICEF in a work they did on providing an evidence-based for the preparedness, the so-called return to investment approach. which is an interesting and excellent way to be able to capture what a difference did it make when preparedness is done right. So, Dylan, I'd like to ask you, what did you learn from this work that you did on the ground in terms of the importance of preparedness? Is it just about cost effectiveness?
Thanks, Panos. And I'd like to say that a lot of the points that Jamie, Tony and Victoria have made are quite pertinent to the discussion, but I just want to take a little bit of a step back before I go into that detail. I mean, first of all, DFID is a great believer in preparedness. We think it saves lives, saves money, and protects development investment. As many of you will have seen, it's put right at the forefront of our new ODA strategy for the whole of DFID. Our Secretary of State when she makes speeches, she does talk about preparedness. And also, you know, we think it's a bit more part of a package, so it needs to be combined with anticipation, risk assessment, building resilience, and we've done a bit of that in all our country programs to look at particularly from the development side of the spend. And I think, you know, we try to think about these things up front. As Jamie mentioned, in Nepal, we did do a lot of work investing there with others on sort of preparedness activities, but also back in London we were working with other bits of UK government. We had contingency planning in place, and I think this is something that we see much more regularly now within DFID. I think also issues around working better with the private sector, the urban issues, cash, all really critical stuff. But going back to the program, I mean, one of the reasons we funded it was, first of all, we believed in preparedness, but also we wanted to develop a model which would help generate the evidence that we would need for senior decision makers in DFID, particularly on the development side, to invest in preparedness. We think, and as I said before, it brought more efficiency and effectiveness in humanitarian response, and we also believe that the evidence that it provided does really make a very strong case that we can use internationally to advocate further for better preparedness programs and more investment. And I think this is really important, particularly at times when, you know, at the moment we've got a lot of stretch on our global humanitarian resource. I think last year the humanitarian appeals were about sort of half funded, or maybe slightly over. We need to really invest so that we can free up money for this emergency type response. And the last thing I want to say just before is really this point about, for DFID, a lot of our investments, and this is where we have the evidence, a lot of our investments where we don't have the evidence are around the conflict piece, and how we get better prepared for conflict and the challenges that brings. We've got some really good evidence here now on the sort of natural disaster side. So really it's how do we take that forward internationally, but also how can we be a bit better on the conflict agenda.
Thanks, Dylan. It's really interesting to see this work that DFID has supported, the evidence base, and that really encourages everybody who's listening to basically make sure the investment takes place. You're basically talking about the humanitarian actors on the ground, but obviously there is the host governments. You mentioned the development actors. Of course, we are focusing on this conversation also on the humanitarian actors, and possibly other donors. So we're looking at 4 circles: donors, government, development, humanitarian actors. How do you make sure that these 4 come together in an approach to ensure preparedness is in place? Dylan, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are that you've skipped a slide, so perhaps I should just, before we go on to that particular thought, on the evidence side of things, what we did actually discover was that when we did the analysis, we had an average saving of 210% across all the investments. So really that's the sort of return for 2 to 1 for us. So I think, you know, just to make the point, and I know there are reports out there and people can read that, but it's this kind of evidence that really did help with that process. So if you carry on through the slides, so, and just on this one, it really shows that actually one of the kind of pieces of evidence was that it's a combination of these different things done at the same time. So, you know, a systematic approach which looked at stockpiles, training staff, and then developing partnerships delivers this full benefit, and we therefore really need a systematic approach. So, coming to your question about working with other donors, well, I think there's 2 issues here. One, at the country level, and Jamie I know is an advocate for this and pointed it out. I think it's really important that humanitarian country teams do reach out to donors in whatever way they can. I mean, sometimes we're on the country team, sometimes we're very linked in through our own donor coordination mechanisms. And I think that way you'll access also the development bits of those organisations, which is really critical for the preparedness side of things. At the global level, I think obviously the World Humanitarian Summit offers a huge opportunity to look at this issue, and particularly to look at how can we link better sort of development with humanitarian. I would expect, you know, for example, World Bank country plans to look much more at risk management, to be much more investing in the kind of preparedness activities, so that when the humanitarian crisis happens, we've already got those systems in place, but we're not using valuable humanitarian funding to do that work. And I think also, you know, we know there's a lot of discussion and common interest amongst donors around climate change, and there are funds for climate financing. That's something else that can help bring us together as donors at the global level. I also think that there's a slight lack of space for donors to get together globally to talk about this issue. It's great that, as Tony talked about, the IASC preparedness group, you know, that's a really important mechanism. How can we sort of match that in a way with a donor group that has similar discussions?
Thanks, Dylan. It's really encouraging for all of us listening to this conversation to have a donor like DFID, hopefully others, really invest in understanding and supporting the importance of preparedness for the work that all of us are trying to do. It's 46 minutes past the hour, and I'm going to be taking questions. Many thanks for all of you who have sent questions, and I want to encourage others who have not sent questions to go ahead by submitting them through the questions box, which is the third button on the top right-hand side of your screen. I'm actually going to take the first question to Tony. And Tony, you talked about the disaster risk reduction. So the question is a disaster risk reduction something that is only considered after a big emergency? How do you mainstream the DRR in the context like Nepal? Over to you.
Jamie might want to jump in after me, but sadly, disaster risk reduction does get sort of a lot more interest in situational post-situations like Nepal. And the fact is, if we're going to do it effectively, it's a long-term investment. But I would say in Nepal, they've had, you know, a fairly extensive program of disaster risk reduction, or elements of it, through the flagships that were set up as the part of the Nepal Disaster Risk Reduction Consortium. And Jamie might want to talk about that. But I think the point that the question makes is very valid. It really gets attraction when there is a large event. If we remember back to some of these, the larger meetings in Japan, the Hyogo meeting happened immediately after the Indian Ocean tsunami, so everybody was on the issue. During Sendai, they had a very large cyclone in the South Pacific that hit Vanuatu, so, you know, it almost set up to get interest in disaster risk reduction. Fact is that these are all programs that require lots of investment that's wider than preparedness. Preparedness being one of the priorities for action in both Hyogo and Sendai. But really, if it's going to be effective, it has to be far, far wider than that. The other thing, of course, is that we are linking our work in the IASC on our preparedness and response capacity to the work that's being done post-Sendai with UNISDR. And I should give a bit of an ad to some of their work, which is titled Words into Action, where they're trying to develop, even though that title's there, norms that would allow countries to better implement what Sendai hopes to do. long-winded answer to a quick thing that would say, sadly, it does only, or not only, it does get a lot of attention after this that wanes sometimes. I don't know whether Jamie would want to add anything about the consortium.
Maybe just a point on the consortium. I think it's quite a bureaucratic endeavour, but at the same time, I think what it did was it did provide a focused platform to bring all the different constituents around the table, and then to set themselves out, as Tony mentioned, these flagships which were taking on things like community response, looking at legislation, looking at retrofitting schools, and key areas of what needs to be done in terms of preparedness. I would say it was probably not as inclusive as it could have been, and I think it tried to achieve maybe too many layers from a technical, operational, all the way through to policy, political, and I think it could have been a bit more broken down. That said, I think it was a very good platform, and I think the investments that came through that led to a much more coherent approach to preparedness.
Thanks to both Tony and Jamie. I have a question for Victoria, and I think, Victoria, with what you said, one of the listeners wants to challenge you. So when you talked about what tested us on the response, you said that the private sector, both from a market perspective and from a capacity to deliver, we did not do as well, or we could have done more, or they could have been more engaged in the way. So one of the callers is basically asking the question saying, tell us a little bit more. How can we involve the private sector? What are the lessons from Nepal? And then how different is it on a natural disaster in a conflict situation with the private sector in particular?
Okay, interestingly, the shelter cluster actually took on a private sector coordinator who has put together a report which you can find on the shelter cluster website. It's pretty it's quite honest, to say the least. We certainly haven't edited it. I think just to get an idea of what the private sector managed to do a lot, our coordinator asked about 500 people or organisations what they had provided, and we only got a 27% response rate. But from that, we learned that they had supported 190,000 households with shelter support. That's a huge number when we consider that 120 operational agencies provided support of some sort to 600,000 households. So it's certainly it's something that it should really be considered significantly. A bit of the feedback that we got from the private sector was that they very much wanted to be involved. But they felt that we, as the internationals coming in, were slightly clipping their wings, was a quote that was used, because they weren't able to necessarily be part of the international response. A couple of criticisms that are well understood. Most of the cluster meetings were conducted in English. I certainly can't speak any other language, unfortunately. But there was a willingness to be part of it. But also, I think what we need to recognise is that this cluster system doesn't work for private sector and for civil society. They don't work as clusters. As they say, there's a quote that says, "We represent all clusters in one." And since our response is not cluster specific, we are mostly volunteers who also have work commitments. So we don't have the time nor the manpower to attend cluster meetings every week and report the data accordingly. So they really are asking us to think differently, and to think differently about how we ask people to report. Additionally, and this is what I mean by honesty, in the report itself, is that this dynamic was mainly attributed to the overtly bureaucraticized INGO sector, and that there's a know-it-all attitude amongst the internationals that come in. We really need to figure out how we can work better with them. I know that there's a huge response, and we really need to harness it.
Thank you, Victoria. That's interesting. I think obviously the role of the private sector is huge. It is one that we need to further expand. I have a question for Dylan. And Dylan, it's a bit of a challenging question. One of the callers is saying, in today's world where we needed more and more conflict with extremist groups, with the question of accountability, making sure that the aid reaches the right people, and accountability to the taxpayer is there of utmost importance to all of us. We feel at our operation that cash could be useful, actually would like to do more cash, but we're not sure to what extent all donors would encourage the use of cash. So can you tell us a little bit the DFID experience in terms of use of cash in, of course, a natural disaster or in a conflict situation, I would say both in preparedness or none in terms of the humanitarian response?
Great, thanks, Panos, and that's a good question, and it's something that we're very passionate about. Hopefully, a number of the listeners today will have read our high-level panel. Well, it's not ours, but the high-level panel report on cash transfers, which we supported, and we think that there is a great deal of opportunity for using cash. It's more accountable to people. We do think that it's much more cost effective. I think that the cash panel report talks about 18 times as cost effective in places to use cash than it is to use other things, but it's not appropriate for everywhere. So I think it's not a silver bullet. I led our response to Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, and there, for example, I think in Tacloban there was a need for more NFIs initially, whereas in Guyana, where markets are still functioning, there was much more opportunity for cash. So I think it's really important that we use it flexibly. I think the other issue for us is if you look at somewhere like Lebanon, I think there were 40 different administrative approaches to using cash, which of course within itself is inefficient. Some people were using vouchers, some people were using unconditional cash. So we do need to be able to have a bit more of a discussion about the application of cash in different types of emergencies and how we can have a bit more of a coherent and a consistent approach. But certainly for us, it's something we believe the international system should be doing much more of, and we are going to be talking about this at the World Humanitarian Summit, and it's an important priority for us. I should also have just said, social protection within kind of longer-term protection crisis is another important mechanism for cash, and that's where we really need to be working with governments. And again, in the Philippines, we did quite a lot of work as DFID with ADB on their social protection program, which had already targeted the most vulnerable in certain regions. So we were able to kind of work through that as well. So it's important to understand the kind of breadth of cash and how it's operating.
Thanks, Dylan, for a loud and clear message in terms of the use of cash and, of course, contextualizing to the situation according to the market capacity and what's possible, but with a message of encouragement to make more and more use. I'm actually going to go to Jamie now. And Jamie, one of the callers sent a question to say, can you say a few words about what you learned, what we have learned as humanitarian community during a natural disaster in terms of gender-specific issues? Did we do the right thing? And of course, this falls within the broader protection response, whether it's a natural disaster or a conflict situation. So, Jeremy, what are your reflections from Nepal?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, we were very conscious of the fact that in our preparations for the floods and the whole ERP, we had a very centralized approach to protection. And in that protection, there's obviously a gender component. And what we did was, when the earthquake struck, we had brought in a GenCap advisor and a ProCap advisor. The protection, the cluster was functioning under the Social Welfare Council of the government and co-chaired by the National Human Rights Commission. And the ProCap advisor was very much in that domain there, advising on that. And then inside the cluster themselves, both the ProCap and the GenCap were making sure that programs that were coming out, getting into the flash appeal and being part of the response were all very gender sensitive, and protection agenda was very much part of that. As part of the flash appeal, you'll see all of the gender will be peppered all the way through that. And as part of the disaggregated data to build the profile of each of the districts as part of our flood preparedness and our general preparedness, we had broken down that data in terms of gender, age, disabilities, ethnic makeup, and other relevant factors. And I think that's what you have to do in order to try and get your response well tailored and focused, and have a better understanding of who are the most vulnerable elements in those communities. And those are allowing very much a gender dimension and also a protection dimension as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamie. I see actually a question that just came also for Jamie saying, you said in your presentation that the clusters were transitioned too quickly to the government in the Nepal context. So can you elaborate what actually did you see missing? What should have happened differently? When do we transition actually, and for how long do we hold in supporting the response? Jamie.
I mean, I think the answer to that is when the government's ready to take on the responsibility. And what we did as the international community, we designed a timeline that suited us. And we wanted to hand over to them and seen as some sort of nationalisation process. Some of the ministries were ready, for example, Ministry of Health. Some of them were not ready. And I think the inconsistent approach across the clusters was part of the performance inconsistency we saw during the earthquake and the response. I would say that what should have been done is they should have mapped out what the capacities and capabilities within each of the line ministries were and designed an individual programme per cluster. And it should have been a partnership from the global cluster through the cluster and the agency on the ground to the government. Instead, what we ended up was with the clusters being in charge by the government, but their inability to operate was palpable, both for the floods and more specifically for the earthquake. And that wasn't the fault necessarily of the cluster lead, the government. It was the responsibility of those who handed it over to them too early. We should have done much more in terms of ensuring they could deliver, not just leadership and accountability, but also they had the substance, the technical wherewithal, and the ability to actually bring on board an incoming load of international actors under their domain. And that was something that was very, very difficult for them to do. As a result of that, you had a sort of a parallel universe where you had the government in charge for the most part of certain parts of it, but below that you had the operational agencies actually running the response to the cluster. And we then faked it at the end in terms of how leadership worked out.
Thanks, Jamie. The next question I'm actually going to take to Tony. And one of our listeners has written to say, you guys picked up an easy preparedness looking at a natural disaster. How about a conflict situation? A conflict, for example, like in Syria, where you have a very complicated situation with an impossible situation to manage. So how can you prepare in an armed conflict with a civil unrest of the scale and complexity that we see like in Syria or other conflict situations?
Thanks for that, Panos. I think the simple answer is this is a reason why we need system preparedness that's outside the country level. We can't be just focused on preparedness in each country, and the humanitarian system is like that. I know my agency, WFP, and others have regional and global systems of preparedness that maintain capability to act in these sorts of situations. I would say one, I'm not sure whether it's a weakness, but one missing bit here is agreed minimum levels of preparedness globally that we could go to the donors or agree with the donors that we need to maintain for these types of activities. Perhaps that's wishful thinking, but I do think we do need a better handle on what we're going to maintain as preparedness at the global level. Panos, I saw there was another question, it's kind of related to this, about NGOs in country. I don't know whether anyone else is going to get that. Okay, that's all.
Maybe I could just add something to what Tony has said there. I mean, for me, if you're talking about civil unrest and the potential that brings, obviously the whole sensitivity issue there is very much you have to put on there. I think scenario planning has to take place in countries. I think you also have to link it to regions and to headquarters. I think the humanitarians are always a bit adverse to connecting the political part of the systems and these political organizations who are in these regions, who are monitoring the situation. I would say that you have to do vulnerability mapping. In terms of disaggregating what would be the dynamics in that conflict, what would the likely outcome be, who would be the population types in there that are likely to move from and to, given if a situation unfolds. And the scenario planning has to be a lot more multidimensional than the sort of current two-dimensional approach we have to it, and it has to be willing to bring in the political actors who we often don't want to discuss these issues with. Thanks.
And I missed one thing I should have added. At the global level, if you remember, the IASC does this early warning process that's linked into the country level, but action in many cases, as Jamie said, political action. And so we really have to be better lined up with that. And indeed, that is a focus in the World Humanitarian Summit, better joined up analysis.
I have two questions that are interlinked that I would like to take to Victoria. It is about the role of the national NGOs and the national staff, the national actors in these conflict situations, who often bear the biggest weight of really being on the front line and delivering. So part one of the question is about the importance of national actors, the partnership, and how have you gone about it in the operations. And part two of the questions is about actually our national staff and their families, who are often they are victims of it. As they try to cope themselves with the crisis, we're also asking them to take the responsibility to help others. So what is the right thing to do and how to go about it, Victoria?
I think certainly, I mean, talking from my agency's point of view as the Red Cross Red Crescent, when we talk about national actors and preparedness being in either conflict or in a natural disaster situation, you know, we have the National Society, we have big donor national societies, the British Red Cross, the American Red Cross, and a number of others who are supporting national societies globally around preparedness. So doing scenario planning for conflict situations on how they will respond. Again, scenario planning for earthquakes, for floods. And they did this, I mean, they certainly did this in Nepal, again, around earthquake scenario planning. But I think the importance of national actors is completely critical. And I think certainly from the Red Cross Red Crescent perspective, it's volunteers that we rely on. And that's sort of tying in with how we support the national staff, who certainly in the Nepal earthquake, I mean, even the coordinator I was talking about, Sanjeev, his family slept in a car for 2 weeks, and yet he still came into work. I think how we support national staff is obviously we need to give that psychosocial support, but also really be there as a mentor. I mean, for me, it was very much, I wanted to respect Sanjeev's position. He certainly was the coordinator in my eyes, and I was his deputy. But I have the experience of dealing with the flash appeals and everything else. So it was really sitting down with him and saying, "How do you want to play this? Go home, sort your family out, and then come back to it." He obviously wanted to be involved as much as possible, but I think you have to be flexible. But you really cannot afford to exclude just because they're trying to sort their families out or get over their own traumas doesn't provide us with an excuse of coming in and moving them on. It's important to give them space, but it's very, very important to give them the role that they've been trained to do. Hopefully that gives you a good idea.
Thanks, thanks, Victoria. I'm actually going to take another question to Jamie. And the caller sent a question saying, in Nepal, did you have enough supplies prepositioned? How quickly did the market come up and running after the earthquake? Jamie.
Thanks a lot. No, we didn't have enough supplies in place. We did have supplies in place, and those were used up rather quickly. Organisations such as the Red Cross and the UN family moved those to the affected areas. As you know, the stocks that we had were used to preposition for floods and for those normal things which happened around the river basins, which was not in this case where the earthquake took place. The other thing is a lot of the stocks you have in place go out of, they're not valid anymore, or they're past the sell-by date. So there has to be a rotation of some of the crops, especially the foodstuffs, and that didn't happen all the time. Some of the things we moved were inappropriate. In terms of the markets up and running, well, in the affected areas, the markets weren't up and running very quickly, but in the other parts of the country, there was many people who were able to supply to the international community things like tarpaulins and things like, corrugated iron sheetings and household goods that we were supplying. The quality wasn't always consistent, and I think that had an impact on how we ended up getting some criticism our way. But I think also we worked with the Chamber chambers of commerce who were national, but also at the same time they were in each of the districts, and they give us a sense of how that market functioned or how up and running it was. And I think there was a lot of work done by the Food Security Cluster and others who actually did a market analysis on a regular basis, so we could see the trend in how these markets were starting to function back again. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamie. I have a question actually for Dylan. Dylan, a caller sent a question to say, the humanitarians, we can do as much as we can, in particular with regards to host governments. How do you see your role in terms of bringing the political side, the political pressure, influence, lobby, front door, back door, behind the front lights, negotiations, lobbying, influence, in order to make sure that the governments do the right thing in supporting the preparedness, ensuring that in particular in political sensitive situations, everybody's on board to do everything possible to save lives and to ensure a good preparedness plan. So if you can elaborate about this humanitarian political link.
Thanks. That's a nice, easy question. I think that you know, it is really important, and we need to recognise that we work in a political space. And you know, for example, if I look at what we do as the UK, you know, we have DFID, which will provide financing, which will be looking in advance at what are the organisations like the World Bank or the EU Development Programme doing, how are they identifying risk within those programmes, and that's similar for conflict as it is for a natural disaster. But I think ultimately we need to ensure that there is the space to have that political discussion, and we would certainly use our ambassadors and networks to have that. I think if you kind of take that up a level, it's really important that the World Humanitarian Summit also delivers on this, that we do have a proper political discussion about, particularly on the sort of conflict affected areas. You know, how do we look at IHL? How are we better able to protect civilians? And a lot of that is in a political solution rather than a technical, developmental or humanitarian solution. So I think it's a combination of both. We need to use those networks. There's no one-size-fits-all model for this, but it's a really interesting question, and I think certainly for the conflict-affected areas, it's absolutely critical that we have a political understanding and context in how we frame our programming.
Thanks, Dylan. I want to flag to all of you listening that we've just opened the closing poll. As you're listening to the last round of questions, please take a minute to give us your feedback in terms of how you found this webinar, what was useful, and more importantly, also any suggestions for future topics as we go through for other webinars. I'd like now to take us to the next question. And the question I'd like to ask it to Jamie. Jamie, in natural disasters in particular, we see many governments who send their military units to support, to respond, often because they have a stronger logistics capacity to be able to respond to the scale of the operation and the speed that is required. In the Nepal floods, there was military interventions or response. In Pakistan, further back during the Pakistan flood in 2010 also, and in other operations, there have been an involvement. Can you tell us a little bit from your own experience how this has worked, the civil, military, humanitarian, military coordination? We all have the same objective, but yet we have to respect each other's boundaries. So how has it worked from your own perspective?
Well, I mean, I think in the Nepal context, this was one of the bigger issues for us. As you know, there hadn't been a major disaster of this kind in Asia and the world since the Haiti. I think it gave a lot of the search and rescue people a green light to come. And what you then had was one airport, which was congested at the best of times with one runway. And then you had these massive numbers of search and rescue teams coming there. There was no way of policing them. There's no way of triaging. And even the ones who were sent back after the government says we don't need them anymore, they didn't go back. They actually landed. And it choked up the airport for humanitarian assistance. You also should know that I think having two neighbours, China and India, who responded very quickly with very large military assets. I think that also skewed the situation slightly as well. So you had a lot of these military components who come in and were not really given the coordination they should have had. I don't think it was the fault of the UNDAC team that came in. It was the fact that the geopolitical, regional political thing was actually quite messy. And as a result of that, I think a lot of search and rescue people left frustrated. I don't think they were given the direction they should have been given, and they never given the green light to go to places beyond the Kathmandu Valley. People wanted to be in Kathmandu Valley because that's where the TV cameras were, but there was far more need outside in terms of search and rescue, except the buildings outside in Kathmandu were not of the same type that require the same type of search and rescue assets available. I would say that for military coordination, it was very difficult, this situation, because of as I said, the neighbours both north and south, and obviously big military components such as the US who were involved as well. To get them on board was not an easy thing to coordinate.
Thank you. Thanks, Jamie. I have a broader question that I've got, which I would like to send to Tony. There's an echo, if you please mute. Tony, the caller is asking, where can I get help in terms of preparedness for my own organization? If I have a question to ask to make sure that we have done all the right things, where do I go? Tony.
Really, if you're talking interagency preparedness, which is what I will answer in the context of, the first port of call should be the resident coordinator's office, who, if they also have an OCHA office or a humanitarian coordinator's office, there would be the ones to initially approach. Failing that, OCHA's regional office for interagency preparedness. And if really, if you are not getting an answer, which would be very strange, the OCHA at the global level or the task team on preparedness and resilience, and their email address is secretariat@un.org. Secretariat, TTPR, all one word, @un.org. But I go back to go local, a lot better.
All right, I hope you all capture the email and to be able to send a question and to get some support from outside. It's almost 80 minutes past the hour. I have one more question to go for Jamie. If any of you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send it in the last few minutes before we close. Jamie, the question I have is related with the engagement of the affected people. How do we go about making sure that from a collective point of view, from the HCT's point of view or the intercluster point of view, how do we know that what we do is what really corresponds to the needs of the community? And more importantly, if we're not doing the right thing, how do we know it? I mean, do we come in these emergencies with the mindset approach that we know best? And how do we adjust our response to make sure that it really corresponds to the needs of the affected people? Jamie.
Thanks a lot, Panos. A very good question. I think we face a problem in every emergency we respond to, in the sense that we don't have a look back for communities, beneficiaries and affected people to tell us what it is they're getting. What we did was, through the support of the regional office for OCHA, we created this Communications for Communities project. It was hosted inside the resident coordinator's office, and it was a way of trying to monitor at community level some of the rumours and some of the words that were being flying about, which collect regular but also longitudinal data on the needs of the communities in order for us to better inform our own projects, our own response in terms of quality, in terms of relevance. It was a common service that was used by all the clusters, the agencies and donors, and I think it gave us a clear insight into how effective we were being. And also, you should know, it also helped to offset some of the criticism that came our way from the media, who were trying to divert the attention away from certain parties and blame some other parties for the lack of response. And I think in this case here, this Communications for Communities project was a very, very good innovation, using mobile phones, using the Boy Scout movements to get out and about and meet with the people and make sure that information came back in when it was processed. And it gave us a very good idea of how how much we were on track in terms of delivering the right kind of assistance to the right people in the right way.
Thank you, Jamie. I'd like to first of all share with all of you and repeat the fact that this webinar has been recorded and will be available online. I also want to let you know that recently in December there was a senior transformative agenda mission, an interagency mission that went to Nepal that captured some of the lessons learned and some actions for Nepal specific, some actions for a global level, and also a checklist that everybody needs to have in their pocket. This report will be released shortly, and they will make sure that all of you who attended this webinar would also receive it. It has a lot of the points that the speakers have been talking today, sharing the best practices and making sure that it inspires and guides operations in many parts of the world. I also want to make sure you're aware of the fact that we will also share the PowerPoint presentation you saw during this webinar on your screen. The polling will still remain open for another 10 minutes, so please take a minute to provide us your feedback in terms of how this webinar was useful and what other suggestions you may have. This brings us to an end of this webinar. I'd really like to thank very much the speakers. I want to thank Tony Gregg, the co-chair for the IASC task team on preparedness and working with the World Food Programme. I want to thank Victoria Stodart with the International Federation of Red Cross and co-lead for the shelter cluster. I'd like to thank Jamie McGoldrick, who is now the Humanitarian Coordinator in Yemen and spoke in this webinar based on his experience in Nepal, where he was a Humanitarian Coordinator. And I'd like to thank Dylan Winder with the DFID in London for also bringing the donor perspective and the work that DFID has been doing in terms of preparedness. I would really like to thank all of you who followed this webinar and this conversation. We very much hope that you find it useful, that it was practical, that it gave you tools, steps, inspired all of you in terms of taking some of the preparedness lessons learned from Nepal and applying it to your operation wherever you are, you're listening to this webinar. So from all of us here in Geneva, wish you a good day and thank you for staying with us for this presentation. Goodbye.